Hello, 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 and welcome back to Tea.Coffee.Water. I am your host, Natalie Poindexter. And during this coffee series, we have been hanging out with Michelle Vryn for a couple of weeks now. And she has just been dropping knowledge bomb after moment of amazingness. So we are wrapping up this series. And I just want to say thank you, Michelle, for being here and giving us your time, your energy, your space, your brilliance.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I feel like this has given me so much energy to just express, but also think differently. So it's pouring into my cup too. My Tea.Coffee.Water, it's pouring into all my cups as well.
Yes. Oh my gosh. And yeah, I want you guys to know that we have prompts of what we're going to say, but this isn't planned. We don't rehearse this. We did a 35-second overview of what we were going to touch on, but the comment you just made about filling your cup is the mantra for the water series. And it's so impactful to have a space where you have to be on, right? Because we got to make sense for the listeners, but you also have to get something back from doing this. And thank you for saying that. Yeah. So today we are going to be talking planning, big picture, rolling all of this in. I don't want to say with a neat little bow, but we've said a lot over these past few weeks around a variety of different things. We've talked strategy, we've talked sustainability, of course, fundraising. We talked education and access last week. And throughout all of these conversations, we have just been dropping nuggets, providing data points and data sets. And at the end of this episode, so hang out, y'all, because we have a little treat for you, which I think is just going to be great. But I know, Michelle, we talked last week and we were saying things like, yes, make sure you have defined OKRs and KPIs, and you're working towards this outcome, this success you're building. You want to make sure that your organizational structure is developing towards your success, right? And all of that is just from the top down, intricate details and everything in between. And so I am just curious, right? We've to track it all the way back to get successfully funded or to fundraise or to grant, whichever world you're saying, right? We're saying when we're talking about success, how do you have that conversation internally to say, what is our big idea, right? What is that nugget that we are working towards that we can all say, yep, check box, check, we agree. This is what success looks like for our organization. And then rolling that into, these are the objectives and key results, okay, OKRs, or our key performance metrics or indicators, whichever you so choose. And that is directly correlated to our program, which is then directly correlated to our funding avenue and our funding planning. And then at the end of the day is wrapped up within our mission. How do you begin to have how do you mentioned and you gave us that nugget of you got to start at the end.
Yeah. So for me, I think it's funny, Natalie, that we actually haven't talked about Shark Tank at all on the series yet, but I'm fixing to. So I'm going to get it in before my last episode. And, when you were speaking about how do you do this, I think for the for-profit people or entrepreneurs that are listening in, that whole Shark Tank pitch thing that happens, right? We've seen the show and you have to go in and quickly say this is my product. This is how I think it's going to impact the consumer. This is why the consumer needs it. And this is how we're going to make money off of it. And if you've watched as many episodes of Shark Tank as I have, there's always these follow-up questions, right? So the sharks will ask, but what's the profit margin? And how are you going to scale this? Is this a franchise model? Are you staying in local stores? Do you want to go to big box stores, et cetera, et cetera? So it's in a lot of ways when we're talking about how do we define success, we're kind of at the same time saying, how do we create a theory of change internally that answers all of these types of questions, but towards social change, right? And so we talked about last time how much the market indicates success. And you could say a company is successful or not successful based on how much profit they're making, right? And so for us, it's not that it's impossible to define success, but you do have to do it in a very structured way, because you're talking about very intangible things, and also things on a very large scale, like systemic scale, right? Like food insecurity, things that are wrapped up in politics. So you have to ground your work so you just don't float away in all the abstractness. And for me, I think grounding the work, I really like pushing folks to think about, what is your theory of change, and writing that on paper. So let me kind of break this down for you.
Sure,
So,
please.
and there's different, like, you can just also just Google like, nonprofit plus theory of change, like examples, and you can see like people's, because there's a lot of ones that are public. Typically, these are started as like internal documents, but people share them a lot. So it's not like something you couldn't find. Like, you can find other people's theory of change to get you a good sense of what they look like. But all of them share really starting out, like getting really clear on what you're trying to achieve. And just kind of running with that food bank example we cited last time, you may be a food bank, but food banks have very different theories of change. Some of them are just about distribution. Some of them we're going to have education wrapped in. Some, may have advocacy or lobbying wrapped in. So each organization needs to have a unique vision on what they want to achieve. And then once you have like that larger piece, you can think about, how will change happen based on that vision. So if you're at the food bank, and education and educating the community about food insecurity is important to you, then how do you do that? And that's like where your OKRs come in. Like, what would that look like? So would that be going to communities that don't suffer from food security, that do suffer from food security? So you can see, like, when you're writing this down, it becomes actually very specific. And then once you figure out, okay, so what would those strategies look like? You can ask questions on, how do we track them? How do you understand the benchmarking of it, right? Like, are we doing it or are we not doing it? And like I said, like, this can get, like, I think, very convoluted on, tracking it, but it doesn't have to be that huge of a task. But I do think one thing I would caution people on is, it does have to involve numbers, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're not measuring something, you can't track it. So you can't just say like, well, we're going to go out and do, 2 education events every year in 2 different cities. While that's a worthy thing to strive for, you don't know. It's a good plan. And but I would say you're missing the last step, right? Of like, are we trying to gauge the experience people are having? Are we actually moving the needle on how they're viewing food insecurity? Because if you're not, and like, for example, the education content isn't resonating, isn't landing, maybe you need to translate to different languages. Like, you don't know all those things unless you're asking people, how is your experience with this? Do you feel like, you learned? So there has to be that tracking piece,
Yeah, everything you are saying, right, is like speaking to my student public health heart, because I had to, again, it's like proof of concept, right? Like, I'm like, oh, we are going to save the world as public health students. We all think it. We think there's an initiative we're going to do, right? And we're not very, like, it directly is like a simile to nonprofit space, right? Like, have this idea, we're like, yes, this is going to be a thing that we do and we establish and accomplish, and it's going to be fantastic, right? And we are like trying to prove this, obviously, to like a professor, and then outside of school, now it's like local governments or other organizations. And one of the things we use are logic models. And we're very structured in everything that we present, and I can definitely throw like a link to a logic model in the example, but in the show notes, but everything you've just said, right, is like, you can have your events, but if you're not familiar with logic models, and I won't go too far into it, but right, like, what do you need? Like you said, how do you know that that event is successful? So what
Yeah.
do you need to run that event? And it's all the way down to like signage, printing supplies, uh, uh, getting permits to have your event space or wherever it might be, right? And then you're saying on this space, it's a, think of like a, for all of the folks that aren't watching us, right? Think of like rows and columns, right? So your columns are all connected, and they're saying, okay, well, you have these items that you need that's directly related to this event. And you have your goal, you have your objective on there. And you're saying, okay, it's these moments that within our program where we're going to be using these supplies. And then you're like, okay, who's using these supplies? And you're saying, and I know we've briefly touched on like volunteers, staff, community, right? Like you're listing out every single stakeholder that is going to be utilizing the supplies for this event related to these projects. And then you have like your short-term goals, which is like, by the end of that event, what did you hope to do? And then maybe in like 6 months from that event, what are you hopeful that that event did? What was the success, the outcome of doing that event? And then you have your long-term goal, right? And it's like, did you make a difference?
Yeah.
You know? And I think the piece, even to circle back to what you've said before of like, it's okay if it wasn't spot on, is there's a moment in there where you have these like key assumptions. And we are confident, right? We go out into this nonprofit space, we go out as public health folks, and we're like, yep, we have planned, we have researched, we have decided that this is exactly how it's going to work. But what happened? We hope people show up.
Yeah.
And that's our key assumption, right? Like we truly think that people are going to like come to this event that we've planned. And you have that built in to say, well, if they didn't come to the event, what did we do wrong, right? And like you now have this item that you can go back and refer to, and what you didn't put in of your needs was a marketing campaign.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So anyways, I just like thinking about everything you just said, right? Of like, what's a tool that can then be used to have that conversation? I don't know. Is that like are logic models a thing? I don't know.
They're totally a thing. And
Okay,
I was just gonna say, because I feel like, you know, there's a way that people get lost or turned off of these conversations too, because there's so many different terms for overlapping definitions of things, right? And so I don't think Natalie and I are like really tying you to like, you have to do a logic model or a theory of change, but it's like whatever you want to call it, you can call it something else internally. But I think what you have to do is you have to really think about, here's my mission statement. What are the key strategies that we think are important to carrying out that mission? And if we zoom out like to other nonprofit missions that maybe we only know just, you know, from its namesake, we know that there are different theories of change. Like I'm thinking of like the Girl Scouts, for example. One of their big things is, of course, like empowering young women through entrepreneurship, selling cookies. That's something that's very unique to them. So there's tons of other nonprofits who are trying to encourage young women to, you know, grow into their full selves, to have community support. There's tons of organizations that do that, but their theories of change don't include exactly what the Girl Scouts does. That's what makes, you know, the Girl Scouts the Girl Scouts. And so we see like these brand differentiations, but I think if you peel that veil back a little bit, you'll see it's actually nuances in their theories of change. In the conservation role, for example, I'm thinking of Greenpeace. You know, Greenpeace and their theory of change, they are very bold. They're, you know, high advocacy, and that's like part of their personality, their brand, right? But it's also part of their theory of change. There's tons of other national and international conservation organizations that don't have that as part of their character, the way they approach their work. So, you know, yes, a theory of change is a logic model that can be written down and you should reference it, but it also informs like everything else, like your brand personality, how you talk about yourself. So it's really like this central piece that we just definitely need to spend the time on to do.
And, I think just the, like, when we were planning these sessions, like, because we are talking about planning, but we also put some time, effort, and energy into planning and making sure that the message that we wanted to deliver, right, like we could have this very organic conversation around it. And it wasn't just like, thank you for your input, Michelle. I have one more question for you, right? Like, it was just this engaging conversation, right? That we both had some sort of experience and expertise and understanding on it. But one of the comments that you made was like adaptation. And it's repeated, right? We're talking about change management. And I think, folks hear the word change and they're like, ew. But what I want to impress upon everyone is COVID forced us to change. Like, we didn't have a choice but to change, right? And so now I think even like congratulating ourselves around the fact that, yeah, you can shift, you can adapt, and you can change your processes, whether you're forced, right? Pandemic, we didn't have a choice, or you make that conscious decision internally within your organization to like, this is how we're going to how we are going to be as an organization. This is how we are accepting our theory of change and implementing it from top down. And I'm curious, right? Like, as a fundraiser, you are, in more senses of not, the bread and butter, right? Like, if the fundraising doesn't happen, then maybe the organization doesn't stay open. But typically fundraisers are not the C-suite. And so when you're having these conversations up and you're sharing with your C-suite and just to your years of experience, it doesn't have to be with one star, right? But just like, you're like, hey, this is the process that we need to implement in order to raise the funds that we've said we need. And I understand these things, but I'm missing these parts, because if I don't have the concept, then I can't go get the money.
Yeah.
And how do you like tap into that trait?
Yeah, I mean, I do think you're right. That's something as a fundraiser, and I'll speak to all, fundraisers on the call, of which there's many varieties and looks and appearances of fundraisers. Like some of them aren't even called fundraisers, right? But they are like the chief fundraiser. So for all of us fundraising, I do think it's important for us to lean into that role, because oftentimes I've seen with program staff, they honestly don't know how specific your theory of change, your KPIs need to be to have a fruitful conversation with a donor. And again, like, it's the whole Shark Tank pitch thing. Like, if you're an entrepreneur, and I mean, seriously, like if you're pitching to investors and you've done that 1, 2, 10, 12 times, you're going to learn something, because people are going to tear apart certain aspects of your plan. And the next time you get up there, you're going to have that piece completely filled up, like just, it's going to be better. And so I think in fundraisers, sometimes we don't necessarily see how much value we are taking away from hearing the critique in those conversations. And it's hard to translate that sometimes to program staff, because ultimately it is on the program leads to set that program direction and strategy. We don't do that as fundraisers. We support you in everything you do, but like, you need a vision and you need a way to track the specific strategies to enable that vision. And I think sometimes for me, and I'll just speak from my own seat, maybe others on the call feel similar, I think it's kind of like a dance you figure out with each program staff of how much do you help them without them feeling like you're overstepping. And some are like, hey, I know I need the help. Please help me. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, come on, bring it all. And so I think some are like, I don't know why we need to be that specific. And it's like, because it is sometimes a one-shot deal, right? And anyone who's ever done any kind of pitch investment will get this of like, if you walk in and your plan seems very loose and you just seem really passionate, but you don't really know how you're going to get the work done, they don't feel comfortable investing in you, so that first impression, you need to pull that off if you can. And so it is like this skill set a fundraiser needs to embody of like pushing, but in a partner way and not too much, because technically it's not your program, but you need them and they need you. And I think, figuring out that dance is an art.
And I'm hearing again the same themes of relationship building.
100%.
Right. And I'm just like curious. I know that this is going to be a really random question for you, but I was like, oh, I wonder if she has this just like up her sleeve. Has there been a time, place, situation, organization, or maybe even just like a specific program lead that you've worked with that the relationship has been there, the role understanding has been there, where you're like, I need these details, and they're like, not a problem, and they can rattle them off to you, or like you're explaining up, right? And whomever you're explaining up to, and you're saying like, those requests are not going to be a thing, right? And you're having to like lead in the conversation both directions. Is that an experience that you've had where you're like, this was like ideal, this was fantastic?
Yeah, I will say, giving the scientists and conservation space like a shout out, I think a lot of people coming from academia really get, especially if you're like publishing research, they really get that need to track stuff because they've been held accountable to that like their whole lives, so it's not at all like asking for too much from them. I think that they're very amenable to metrics and understanding like why you need to lay out, these are the strategies, these are not only our strategies but our prioritized strategies to make this impact, like that. They're so used to doing that. I will say, like, I wouldn't, in a lot of scenarios, they're not the perfect partner because they also tend to be like not the best at translating things to like a layperson audience, right? Like they're because they get what they do, but they're so steeped in their field that they need you to make the story more of a narrative that anyone can follow along to. But I do really appreciate like not having to explain the KPIs and metrics to them though.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, and I'm curious too. And I know exactly what you mean, because I'm going to always tap into the public health world. Like before COVID, nobody even knew what public health folks did, right? Like I think I told my dad I was going into public health, and he was like, and what do you, why would you do that? He was like, I'm going to save the world, Dad. And he was like, but you're literally saving lives right now, Natalie. Like, why don't you just stay in EMS? I'm like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Right. But yeah, in my mind, right, I'm like, that's the public health Kool-Aid we drank. But only other public health folks got it. So when you're saying like health, like when you're saying change, like change the theories of change, I'm like, ooh, which ones? Like, should we go into the social cognitive theory? Should we talk about like the health, like the like the health behavior change model? Like there's so many different ones we could, and I could go on this, like I could totally geek out.
Yeah.
But if I geek out and you're like, I just need to know, what are you measuring and how much money do you need? And I'd be like, oh, you don't care about those pieces. Okay. Right. Like, but it is, I think the big piece of what I heard you say is you have to truly know the ins and outs of your program.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think one thing as a development professional that I enjoy is you truly are cross-functional across all teams, right? And if you're not, then you need to figure out how to become more cross-functional, because think about it, like you have to partner so closely with your finance team to understand like revenue projections. You obviously have to partner with all of your program leads to understand their programs, because when you're out in the community, you're the ambassador for them. So you need to know not only what are they currently doing, but what do they need and what do they want to be doing, like even next year, right? Because they all have ideas of like, how to make their programs better. And you have to know all of that. But then you also, of course, partner so closely to the CEO or ED seat, because you just need to know, what is that person's vision? Are there things coming down the pipeline that like are new things to raise money for? So you really are like making friends with every part of the organization and keeping up with them. So that, I mean, you're right. It's like going back to relationship building. A lot of that kind of faces back towards yourself, like internally, and you have to be good at that internally too, not just externally.
Ooh, so this is a like something I was just like I'd love to ask you this. So let's just role play, quote unquote. Okay. You are brand new nonprofit, you're funded to operate for your operations. Let's just say that you're funded to get your operations started.
Love it.
Right. And like now they're ready to hire a Michelle. They're ready to hire a fundraising development in role. And you come in, right? And you know you're in this brand new organization. What steps would you suggest, right? Because I know some of these conversations we've had thus far are like, everyone wants to start a nonprofit. And so like, before you tiptoe into that space, theoretically, and I think this will like lead into how we're going to wrap up our series as well, right? But if we could pick the brain of your expertise and say, okay, we've got our ED, we've got our CFO, we've got maybe COO of some sort, right? Some operational person who's helping with that structure. And now it's time to start talking funding, continuous funding. What is like a planning process that you would put in place? Like, let's just pretend again, we're on calendar year. You're starting January 1, and now you have to institute this plan to build with this team. And like, yes, that's, obviously like personnel will then roll in, and then the program leads will roll in. And so like, I don't know, I guess it's a two-part question. It's a little of like, how would you structure that if you could, and then, or when you do? And then the other piece is, how do you integrate the new folks into that plan?
Yeah, so I feel the first couple of things I would ask for and look for would be like these kinds of theory of change documents, right? So let's just continue like with the Girl Scouts. Like Girl Scouts is a young woman, leadership training kind of vibe. But again, there's a lot of nonprofits that do this. They do it in their own certain way. So coming in as a new fundraiser, definitely understand, okay, I see your mission statement, like I can read it online, but
Sure.
tell me specifically how like you're achieving that. And maybe that is online too. And really understanding what those program strategies look like, because that will define your funders, right? Because there's some funders who they are just all about summer camps for kids, right? That maybe are underprivileged, for example. But if that's not what you're doing, then I would know not to approach those kinds of funders. If you're going more for like inner city youth kids specifically and nobody else, then like there's funders who align specifically with that. So you can kind of begin to see in this hypothetical world how really knowing what you're doing and not being too flippy floppy with it, like we're doing this one year, then we're doing this one year, because what you're doing is going to be a natural attractor to certain funders, because they're just there's certain things that they want to invest in. But you have to know who you are to say, do I fit with that funder? And sometimes the answer is no, and that's okay. But don't waste your time trying to do round hole square peg kind of thing. That's never a good look. But so I would say like really understanding the theory of change, but also as a new fundraiser, I think, or a new fundraiser to a brand new organization, one thing I would always ask too is, how long have you been doing this? And do you have like any metrics at all to gauge what you've been doing? Because that's a tricky one, right? Like, kudos to you for starting a nonprofit. I'm sure it's a great cause, but if you go into any kind of pitch investment, whether it's for profit or nonprofit, and you're just like, I don't really know if it's going to work. Like that's, or we've never actually like tested this method before. Like that's a hard sale. It's not impossible, but I think it's difficult unless you have a funder or a group of funders who are like in it, right? Like in it for like 5 years to kind of give you a runway, which does happen.
Yeah.
That does happen.
Yeah.
But I think those metrics for new organizations are so key because, funders don't, like you're new, like they don't know. They don't know if your strategies are going to work. And some are fine with them not working. They just want you to try. But some, I think, want to see a little bit of a history there and maybe even what you've learned if there were, quote unquote, not successes.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic too, because part of I think, tie it all in, right, is like when you said, I'm going to go and start this nonprofit, and you thought beyond the passion, there was a reason that you wanted to start this nonprofit, right? We talked food insecurity, right? And so if you're like, well, I live in a food desert, and I know that I personally and my neighborhood deals with food insecurities due to these things. And I love when you used the Shark Tank piece, right? Because it's a for-profit conversation, but it's such a relevant cross-industry conversation of like, if you can't go sell somebody else, then like, how do you think you're like going to sell your participants, right? Or like, how are you going to get the community to buy in because you are a community-based organization, right? And so it's like, again, that your success, your outcomes to get to that level of success, your objectives, like, are you hitting these things? And then also like, can you tell it to, and I think this is beyond just the program leads of like, can you tell that story to your fundraiser, to your operations, to your board, to your community, right? It's like, you have to be able to switch up your story, your narrative, right? To tell the story depending on which audience you're in front of.
Yeah.
And I think that is just like the piece behind what I've heard some nonprofits say, like, well, this is our mission. That's fantastic. But what are you doing to like implement that portion of your mission into the community or into your programs or whatever it might be, right? Like, it has to be more than just like, well, this is our big idea and we're not really sure how we're going to go and get it done, but we just want to go get it done, right? And I think that's like how nonprofit conversations start. They're like, we don't know how we're going to do it, we're just going to go do it. And it's this mentality almost, right? And so I'm curious, we've been very strategic, and that was all alluding up to, if we could have some fun, right? Like, y'all, we have given you the business, the True Coffee series, an edition of this. But if we could reimagine what nonprofits and community-based organizations looked like, and that is, and I mean like big picture, I'm talking like social justice change, right? Like, we are truly like, yes, we are touching policy, we are touching systems, we are touching advocacy, we're touching lobbying. Like, when and I know, and I'm hopeful that we can continue our big ideas and like bring in some more nonprofit folks who have, bring Greg back, bring in some other people to have this conversation with us. But like, boy, if we could like start from scratch, if someone was like, Natalie, Michelle, this was a fantastic podcast series, do you guys want to go start a nonprofit? One, I'd be like, absolutely not. It would be no for me. I'm just kidding.
I'd be like, did you listen to the series? No. There were subtle hints in there. I don't know. Maybe they were too subtle, maybe.
Let me be very, very clear. No, I'm just kidding. But I mean, right? Like, I do think, right, if you could pick your perfect, right? And you were like, I know there's not this perfect, but like, if you could pick your like theoretical perfect, and start to build and develop a nonprofit? I'm guessing I know what you're going to say, but like, where would you start?
So if I were to build my perfect nonprofit,
Mm-hmm.
I would think, I don't know so much about the mission or what it would do, but I'm thinking about the process of building. And so in that process of building a nonprofit, I feel like there has to be this force of, you have an idea, for a social change group, a social change need. But I think that I want there to be some kind of like force or checks and balance system to check to see who is in this space already.
Mm-hmm.
And I want people to not only be compelled, like ideally this is like my, magic wand moment. I would want people to have to reach out to like 2 or 3 people in that orbit to really think about, is there a partnership here for us? And maybe there's not, right? Like I do think some nonprofits stand alone and that's good because, they're making it work. But I feel like in the process of creation, that's a force I just want to see happen, like just like a due diligence step there.
Yeah.
Like, can we make that happen?
No, I love it because I was like, she's gonna go process. In my mind, I'm like, I know she's gonna start process. I feel it. But again, right? It's that very like project management brain, the mindset of, and I big shout out to Rosie, who is like the PMP that I do so much work with. I have these like massive ideas and I'm like, if we could just do this. And she's like, stop. No, wait a minute. I have so many questions. And I'm like, stop asking me questions. I know what I'm talking about. She's like, oh, I don't doubt that. But I need to make sure that this makes sense. So let me finish asking my 26 questions and then I'll tell you if I agree. Right. And like, what I'm hearing you say is like, you need someone to say all of those things too, but also like to ask you those questions of, is this valid? Is this relevant? Is this going to be effective, efficient? Are there smart, like, is this a smart goal to accomplish? And truly just like challenge you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And one thing I feel like I'm, I know we're getting closer to the end of this episode, but I'm going to shoehorn this one in anyways, because hey, like I'm a routine guest here now. So I feel like I'm taking my power in, in this seat. So I think one thing that we maybe can talk about more later, because it's a larger topic, but there is this concept and real thing of fiscal sponsorship to where you don't have to become your own 501c3. Mm-hmm. You can carry out a fiscally sponsored project underneath someone sponsoring that project. It could be a community foundation or another nonprofit, to where like you're not responsible for raising funds like for your overhead, for the lights, for the copy machine, for all that stuff. Like you're just doing your program work and you can be nestled within a fiscal sponsor. And so this has been a thing for decades, but it is something I feel like we've often pushed to the side or don't really check out thoroughly, because like we want our nonprofit, like it's about like we want ownership of it, but sometimes so it's I mean, and I think you want that identity with it almost. But if it's really about serving the community, I just want us to like check ourselves by asking the question, is it better as a fiscal sponsorship, to where like, for example, if there's a lot of organizations, particularly in the disaster resiliency space. So like when a natural disaster happens, there's tons of groups that come in and like do cleanup work in the community. But a lot of these, they're 501c3s, they operate year round, but a disaster doesn't happen year round. And so the only thing they're really doing as a nonprofit may be like their annual golf tournament or their annual crawfish boil, and it's a fundraiser. But like, you don't need to file like all the IRS paperwork and like rent the building, and you should just be a fiscally sponsored project underneath someone else, because it's not year round. Yeah. So there's some missions that have that kind of orientation. So that's another thing I just want to make sure the guests could listen to, and we can drop some links into research on fiscal sponsorship.
Oh, that's massive. I mean, and I think that's an episode within itself, right? Which is like, spoiler moment, we're definitely going to do more episodes together, but surprise. But yes, right. Like I remember being at the One Star Summit, right? And I was table hopping to the vendors and being on, and I'm like, my brain is a foggy cloud at that point. And I get to this table who was talking about fiscal sponsorship. And they were like, oh, are you interested? And I was like, no, I don't really think that that's what I'm, having a conversation about and thinking about, right? Like, and then I remembered like, oh, you're that type of fiscal sponsor, right? Like you're the one that's helping us get off of the ground if I'm not particularly ready to be on my own, right? And I think even having that conversation of, right, showing some humility and saying, can I still get the job done?
Yeah.
Because I want to own it. Yeah, of course, right? Like we want to be in charge, but like, can you still do the thing? Can you still keep, from many episodes ago, the marshmallow at the forefront of all of the conversations?
Yeah.
Because then, yeah, you probably can do it. And you don't, it doesn't have to be forever, right? You don't have to.
It's not in perpetuity.
Yeah. And so, oh my gosh, like, I don't know how in all of our planning conversations
we didn't include this, but it's fine. It'll manifest where it's meant to,
Absolutely. Fluidity that is all about tea, coffee, water. Like we try to stay on topic, but if the conversation shifts, then that's just where we go. And so, yeah, I mean, I think too, right? Like our whole idea around having this ideation and theoretical series of, if we could just shake some shit up, right? If we could, and like, we've already dealt with it.
Yep.
We've already been shaken to our core through COVID, and we didn't have a choice. And now that we do have this choice of how we shift and how we change and how we grow and how we develop, let's do it a little different.
Yeah. Let's empower ourselves to move through it with like creative intention, like that's what I'm feeling.
Yes. No, I mean, of course, empowerment, right? Like, yes, like drive that through and through. And so, yeah, it's going to be a couple of weeks before we get back on with Michelle, but like, and it's going to be a whole situation. Like there's going to be people joining us there. It is not going to be as structured. It's going to be like idea go. And we're going to just like have fun, right? Like I think of like flip charts and sticky notes, right? Like you're just slapping stuff on the wall. Like I'm gonna see if it sticks.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna hear from the others in the room and be like, "Are you insane?" Right? Or like, "Yes," right? And you get this like victory, but you also get this like, "Were you for real? Like, did you really just say that?" And you're like, "Yep, I want to do it." I'm like, "Okay," right? And you have that space to be vulnerable, but have fun, right? Like I can pitch out my ideas of massive, of just randomness and be like, can you get me funded, Michelle? And you'd be like, never, no. Why would you ask me that? Like, don't do that.
I'm like, I will bring in your PM first and then we will see.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Rosie will probably dreadingly come join at some point. She's like, girl, I'm going to support you from the back, from the way back. But yeah, oh my gosh, it would be great because if just to like wrap all of this up, right? Like being able to have someone that challenges you in any way when you're talking business, it makes you a better business owner. It makes you a better employee. I mean, as a whole, right? And so I think even like being empowered to ask questions. Which is something I talk about on a different, like when I'm off on my own, of why I started my own business, right? Of like, it's okay to ask why, right? And so I just want to like, yes, y'all stay tuned. I will drop a little teaser when the next round of episodes are going to be planned and ready to go. But Michelle, I just want to thank you again. Like, I can't say thank you enough. From the moment I met you, I was like, yeah, I got to talk to her. I don't know. And I don't know where it's going to go, but I got to talk to her. And now we've spent weeks talking, and it has been such a fantastic experience.
Oh my gosh, I've loved it. I've had so much fun. And I feel like, you said we need this kind of vibe around the social change space. So, hey, we're creating it. So kudos to us. I love
Yes.
it. And I can't wait to come back.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you for your support. Anything that we've mentioned, we will drop into the show notes. And yeah, this wraps up our first coffee series, but one of many. And so we will see you next week for more Tea, Coffee, Water. Thanks, y'all.